There is an announcement that went out from Buckingham Palace that most people read and filed away as routine palace administration. 3 sentences of institutional language, the kind that gets buried on page 6 and forgotten by the following morning. But inside the walls of that building, in the offices and corridors, where people have spent their careers learning to read exactly this kind of language, those 3 sentences landed like a verdict, and the woman they were written about did not find out from a press release. She found out from her husband's face. You cannot understand any of what follows without understanding the position Charles has been in since February 2024. That is when Buckingham Palace confirmed that the king had been diagnosed with cancer. The statement was careful, the way palace statements always are. It told you enough to explain the changes you were about to notice in his schedule, and nothing else at all. No staging, no prognosis, no detail that would let anybody outside those walls build a complete picture. But the incomplete picture told its own story anyway. Engagements reduced. Overseas travel pulled back. The public appearances that did happen were shorter, more controlled. The energy in them rationed in a way that had not been true of Charles before. People who had watched this man work for decades noticed it immediately, because you cannot watch somebody ration themselves without understanding what the rationing means. And here is what the palace never said out loud, because it never says the things that matter most out loud. The rationing did not only affect the engagements on the court circular, it affected everything. A king managing a serious illness and conserving his strength for the duties he cannot delegate is a king with less left over for the duties that never appear on any official schedule. The private ones. The ones that happen in corridors and telephone calls and rooms with no diary entry attached. For 25 years, Charles had been the one person in that entire institution whose protection Camilla could rely on absolutely. He had spent 3 decades fighting for her, against an institution that did not want her, against a public that despised her for longer than most people now remember, against his own sons, both of whom sat across from him and told him plainly not to marry her. He fought every one of those battles, and he won them, because when Charles committed to something, he committed completely, and his position gave him the authority to make that commitment mean something. But authority and capacity are not the same thing. And from February 2024 onwards, his capacity had been narrowing. Quietly, without announcement, without any single moment you could point at as the turning point. The way a tide goes out. You do not notice the water leaving. You notice that the rocks are showing. By the time the events of this story began to move, Charles was a king who still held every title and every formal power the Constitution gave him. And he was a man who, on his worst days, could not be in the room. And everybody inside that building, including the woman who had spent 25 years relying on him to be in every room that mattered, had been quietly adjusting to that reality for longer than any of them would say on the record. Now let me take you to William, because William is the engine of this story, and you need to understand exactly what kind of engine he is before any of the rest of it makes sense. He is not a man who acts on emotion. That is the thing people keep getting wrong about him, because they watch him shake hands in a receiving line with a woman he despises, and they conclude he has made his peace with her. He smiles at the right moment. He stands in the right position for the photograph. He says the correct thing in the correct tone at every public occasion that requires him to be in the same room as her. And people watch all of that, and they decide it means something about forgiveness. It does not mean anything about forgiveness. It means he is very good at waiting. He is not a man who acts on emotion. He is a man who acts on timing. And there is a very specific and important difference between those two things, because a man who acts on emotion can be managed, You can read him. You can provoke him into moving before he is ready, and then use the move against him. A man who acts on timing cannot be managed at all, because he will not move until the ground underneath him is exactly where he needs it to be. And by the time it is, there is nothing left for anyone else to do. The calculation started when he was 16 years old and sat with what he knew about his mother's marriage and what he had watched happen to her inside the institution and what he understood about how it had ended. He did not shout. He did not confront anybody. He did not pull anybody aside and deliver a speech about what he thought. He filed it. He went quiet in the way that turns out to be the most dangerous kind of quiet, which is the kind that is not processing, the kind that is building something. And then he built it for 25 years without letting anybody see the blueprint. Look at what he has done with every institution that has ever passed through his hands, because the pattern is consistent enough to be a policy. The Duchy of Cornwall came to him in September 2022 when Charles took the throne. It is one of the largest private estates in the country, generating roughly £30 million a year across 135,000 acres of land, property, and financial holdings. William had it for less than 4 years. In that time, he replaced outside contractors, restructured the management team, and dismantled every arrangement that ran on personal trust rather than a written agreement. He did not hold a press conference about any of it. He did not issue a statement explaining his approach. He just did it, methodically and completely, in the language of good governance, until the duchy looked entirely different from the inside, and nobody could point at a single decision that was not defensible on its own terms. The Royal Foundation is the same story. Clear accounts published annually, measurable goals with measurable outcomes attached to them. When a program failed to deliver, it was cut, not managed down, not quietly absorbed into something else. Cut. One person who worked inside that structure for several years described William as a man who runs everything as though he has been burned by informality before and now treats documentation as the only real protection against it. That is not a personality description. That is a system. And the system was built deliberately over years after watching his own family damage itself repeatedly through the kind of quiet understandings that nobody ever wrote down and that nobody could therefore ever be held to account for. He had also, in the 18 months before this story reached its climax, pushed a specific reform agenda through the broader palace structure. Tighter controls on the outside relationships senior royals could maintain, mandatory rules around gifts and hospitality from anyone with financial interests connected to the crown, a clear internal order that the monarchy simply could not absorb another access scandal, and that personal trust, however long established, was no longer sufficient grounds for any arrangement involving a working royal. Those rules went to every senior household in writing, including Camilla's. And here's the thing about a man who builds every single move on documented precedent and written protocol and paper that exists in a folder and cannot be argued away. When the moment finally comes, he does not need to raise his voice. He does not need to confront anybody in a corridor or deliver a speech or make a scene that somebody can photograph. The paper does all of it for him, quietly, completely, and without leaving a single thing for anyone to undo. So it pushed this particular moment into motion, because William had been patient for a long time, and patience was working for him. The portrait was on the wall. Diana's patronages were coming back under Catherine's office. The staffing around Camilla had contracted. Her diary had thinned. The balance of power inside that household had been shifting in a direction that served his interests without requiring any single dramatic act. But something changed, and the change did not come from outside the family. It came from inside it. Sources close to that household have described a period of several weeks in which Charles's condition required an adjustment to his working pattern that went beyond what had previously been managed quietly. Days when he was not well enough to chair discussions. A stretch of engagements that had to be redistributed at short notice. And in the middle of all of that, a specific situation involving Camilla that could not be held in the informal space where these things had always been held before. The details of that situation have not been fully confirmed in any single place. What has been reported across multiple sources is this: a decision connected to one of Camilla's patronages and the financial relationship sitting underneath it reached a point where it required a formal, institutional response rather than a quiet conversation. The kind of response that generates paperwork. And paperwork, in William's world, is the moment everything becomes real. He looked at what was in front of him: the documented relationship, the timeline, the rules that had been sent to Camilla's office in writing, the fact that those rules existed on paper, and the situation in front of him existed on paper, and the distance between those two pieces of paper was a gap that somebody was eventually going to have to answer for publicly. He also looked at his father, a man managing an illness, conserving his strength, no longer in a position to absorb a prolonged internal battle on his wife's behalf without it costing him something he could not afford to spend. And William made a decision that he had been moving toward for a long time without ever quite arriving at it. The informal arrangement, the quiet management, the careful calibration of pressure that did not require anyone to say anything definitive out loud. That was finished. Something had to be said, and the person who had to say it was not William. It was Charles. The conversation between William and his father happened on a weekday evening. I am not going to give you a date because the date is not the point. The point is the room. They met at Clarence House, which is Charles's residence, and that choice matters in the way that every choice of location matters in that world, because it meant William came to his father rather than summoning him. And that single detail tells you everything about how William manages the balance between institutional authority and filial respect when those two things pull in opposite directions. He brought a folder. If you have followed this family for any length of time, you already know what a folder from William means in a meeting like this. He carried it in, set it on the table, and left it closed. He did not walk his father through it. He did not summarize the contents, or soften the language, or give Charles any of the diplomatic runway that palace meetings normally provide. He simply told his father what was in it, and then he told him what he believed needed to happen next. Charles listened, and this is the part of the conversation that sources who have described it keep coming back to, because the listening is where the whole weight of it lives. Charles is not a man who is easily out-argued. He has spent his entire life inside an institution that runs on the management of competing positions, and he is better at it than almost anyone. He knows how to find the third option, the formulation that satisfies everybody just enough to keep the room intact. But there was no third option in this conversation. William had done what he always does. He had closed every door except the one he wanted his father to walk through. The documented relationship sat on the table between them in a physical folder. The rules that had been sent to Camilla's office sat in that same folder. And Charles could not pick up the folder and dispute what was in it, because the things in it were true. What Charles said was not captured on any record that has reached the public. What has been described by sources close to that meeting is the quality of what he said, which is that he was quieter than William had expected. Not defeated, not broken. Quiet in the way of a man who has known for a long time that a particular reckoning was coming and has spent that time hoping he was wrong about it. He asked William one question. He asked whether this had to go out formally, or whether it could be handled in the internal way these things had always been handled. William's answer to that question was not unkind. Every source who has described it uses the same word, which is direct. He told his father that the internal way had produced the situation currently sitting in the folder, and that the situation in the folder was the reason they were having this conversation. Charles sat with that for a while. He asked for time. William gave him time. And the days that followed that conversation were, by every account from people inside that household, some of the most difficult Charles had spent in that building. Not because of the illness, because of what he was being asked to do to the woman he had spent 30 years defending. He spoke to Camilla. Those conversations have not been described in any detail by anyone who was present, which tells you something about how much care was taken around them. What has been confirmed across multiple sources is that Camilla understood by the end of those days that something was coming. She did not know the precise shape of it. She knew it was coming because Charles could not keep it off his face. And Camilla has spent 50 years reading that face with the accuracy of a woman whose entire security has depended on knowing exactly what it is telling her. Charles came back to William at the end of the time he had been given. He told his son he would do what was necessary. He asked that the language be handled with dignity. William agreed to that. The announcement was drafted, reviewed, and approved, and Charles signed off on it with the specific and private weight of a man closing a door he had spent most of his adult life holding open. Here is what you need to understand about where Camilla believed she was standing before any of this reached her. She had the title. Queen Consort is not a decoration. It is an institutional position with weight behind it, with a household attached to it, with a role in the formal life of the monarchy that does not evaporate because the people around you are uncomfortable. She understood that perfectly well, and she had built everything around it. She also had 25 years of evidence that she was very good at surviving the discomfort of the people around her. She had walked into British public life as the most resented woman in the country, and she had walked out of it 30 years later with a crown on her head at Westminster Abbey. That does not happen by accident. That takes patience and discipline, and the ability to absorb an enormous amount of hostility without letting it show on your face in a way that gives your enemies something to use. She had been reading the signals around her since the yacht story broke in the summer of 2025. She had felt the diary thinning. She had watched engagements move across to Catherine's office. She had noticed the staffing changes. None of that was invisible to her, and she was not a woman who confused the absence of drama for the absence of a problem. But she had also been reading one signal in particular with a confidence that turned out to be misplaced. She had been reading Charles, and what she saw when she read him was a man who loved her, who was unwell, who was fighting to maintain his working life against a physical reality that was taking more from him every month. What she did not see, because he hid it with the particular care of a man who could not bear to let her see it, was that the fight he was no longer capable of winning was not the one with the illness. It was the one with his son. She had spent 25 years believing that Charles's commitment to her was absolute and immovable, and she was right about that. It was absolute. What changed was not the commitment. What changed was the capacity behind it. And that distinction, the gap between a man who will defend you and a man who can, is the gap that swallowed everything she thought she had. She did not see it until it was already over. The announcement itself, when it came, was 3 sentences long. That is not an accident. In that institution, brevity is never an accident. Every word in an official palace statement has been looked at by at least 3 pairs of eyes before it reaches the public, and every word that is not in it has been removed on purpose. What the statement said, in the formal language the palace uses when it wants to say something definitive without appearing to raise its voice, was that the role of the Queen Consort was being formally reviewed as part of a broader institutional restructure aligned with the Prince of Wales's vision for a modernized monarchy. It noted that certain responsibilities and patronages currently held under the Queen Consort's office would be transitioning to other members of the royal household. It expressed the king's personal gratitude for the Queen Consort's continued commitment to public service. Read those 3 sentences the way a civilian reads them, and they sound like paperwork. Read them the way the people inside those walls read them, and they are a complete and documented transfer of institutional ground. The phrase aligned with the Prince of Wales's vision is the sentence that mattered. Not because of what it says about William, because of what it says about Charles. A sitting king attributing a formal institutional decision to his heir's vision is not standard language. It is a king putting his signature on something he knows belongs to his son, and making that public in the most careful and irreversible way available to him. He did not fight it. He framed it, and the framing is a form of abdication that does not require the word abdication anywhere in the document. The patronages named in the internal brief that went to senior household officials alongside the public statement were Diana's patronages, the ones that had been dormant or reassigned years ago, and that William had been quietly reactivating under Catherine's office for the previous 18 months. Their formal transfer away from Camilla's household was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the direction of travel. What was a surprise was seeing it written down, because that is the difference between a trend and a fact. A fact can be pointed at. A trend can be disputed. Once it is in a document, it belongs to history. The statement went out on a Tuesday morning. By 11 o'clock, it was everywhere. Royal correspondents who had been tracking the shape of things for months had their analysis filed within the hour. The 3 sentences were placed next to the yacht story, next to Diana's portrait, next to the diary reassignments, next to every quiet signal that had been going out of that building for a year and a half. And laid out in a line like that, they did not look like an administrative announcement at all. They looked like a conclusion. Camilla was not at a public engagement when the statement went out. She was at Clarence House, and sources who have described that morning use the same word to characterize her reaction that sources always seem to reach for when they are describing a particular kind of blow to a particular kind of woman. They say, she went still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of a person whose internal system has just received information it does not have a prepared response for. She has spent 50 years building prepared responses to almost everything this institution and this family and this country could produce. The fury after Diana's portrait went up, that she had a response for. The staffing changes. She had a response for that too. She had responses stacked and ready for almost every version of this that she had been able to imagine. She had not been able to imagine Charles putting his name to it. That is the part that went through her. Not the patronages, not the language about institutional restructure, not even the phrase aligned with the Prince of Wales's vision, which she will have understood immediately for exactly what it was. The part that went through her was the signature, because Charles's signature on that document was not just institutional, it was personal. It was the answer to a question she had never asked out loud because she had never needed to, which was whether there was a version of events in which he would not stand beside her. The answer was in 3 sentences on palace notepaper, and she read it in the room he was sitting in. He did not leave her alone with it, which says something about the man. He stayed. He was there when she read it. Sources suggest he tried to explain the reasoning, to give her the same account he had been sitting with for the weeks since the conversation with William. That he had looked at what was in front of him and concluded that the cost of fighting it was something he could no longer afford to pay, not for himself, not for her, and not for an institution he had spent his entire life trying to serve properly. What Camilla said back to him in that room has not been described in any detail by anyone who has spoken to the press. The silence around those words is the one piece of this story that is held completely, and I think it will go on holding, because some conversations belong only to the two people who had them, and this is one of them. What has been described is that she did not stay in the room for long after it, that she went somewhere private, that the household around her adjusted itself in the way that royal households have learned to adjust, which is by becoming very quiet and very busy at the same time, and giving the person in the middle of it the one thing they almost never get in that life, which is an hour that nobody is watching. Let me tell you what her future looks like now, because this is the part that has the most permanent shape to it, and I think it is important to be precise rather than dramatic about what has actually changed. She keeps the title. Queen Consort does not disappear from her name because of a palace statement. The formal constitutional position she holds is tied to Charles's reign, and it holds until his reign ends. Nobody is taking the crown off her head in the middle of a Tuesday morning. What changes is everything underneath the title. The patronages that have been formally transferred are not coming back. They were Diana's, which means their return to Diana's daughter-in-law's office is a signal with a specific and intentional direction, and that direction does not reverse. The staffing that has been contracting around her office for the past year continues to contract. The diary that has been thinning does not thicken. The briefings that stopped landing on her desk do not resume. And then there is the question that everyone inside that building is carrying quietly, which is the question of after. When Charles dies, the constitutional position of Queen Consort ends automatically. She becomes Queen Dowager. The title is honorable. The title is also, in practical terms, the last formal protection the institution owes her. The residences she currently occupies sit within estates that passed to William. The institutional support she relies on exists because Charles is king. The access she has to the working machinery of the monarchy depends on being the wife of the man who runs it. When that man is gone, every single one of those things gets reviewed by the person who replaces him. And that person has never forgotten a single thing done to his mother inside those walls. Charles has reportedly been trying to secure arrangements for her future for some time. Private conversations with William about what provision will be made, what access she will retain, what version of royal life will be available to her in the years after his reign. William has not refused those conversations. He has not slammed any doors in his father's face about it. He has listened, and he has been, by the accounts of people close to those discussions, fair in the technical sense of the word. He has not been warm. And the difference between a future that is technically fair and a future that is warm is a difference Camilla understands better than anyone alive, because she spent decades being technically accommodated by an institution that was never warm to her, and she knows exactly what it costs. She is 67 years old. She has given 30 years to making herself acceptable to a country that initially did not want her at all. She has done that with patience and discipline and an understanding of how this institution works that very few people on earth possess. And she is sitting inside a future that was decided for her in a folder on a table at Clarence House by a man who was 16 years old when he worked out what he thought of her and has not changed his mind about a single word of it since. Princess Anne's position in all of this is the one that never quite reaches the papers in its full form. And I think that is because Anne does not give people enough to write about. She does not grant interviews. She does not brief journalists. She does not give the kind of reaction that produces a photograph you can run on the front page. She gives you silence and a look across a room and occasionally 5 words, and she has learned over 70 years that 5 words from the right person in the right room do more damage than any statement a press office ever produced. She knew what was coming before it came out. She has been inside William's thinking on this longer than most people realize, not as an architect, because this was William's plan in William's own structure, and Anne would not want credit for someone else's work, but as a presence, the older woman in that family who watched everything that was done to Diana and held it the way Anne holds everything, which is silently and permanently, and with a patience that makes William's patience look hurried. When the announcement went out, sources suggest she did not celebrate. That is the most Anne detail in this entire story. There was no satisfaction expressed, no private remark that made its way into anyone's account of her reaction. She read it, she understood it, and she went about the rest of her day. Because for Anne, this was not a victory. It was a correction. And a correction, however long overdue, is not something you celebrate. It is something you file under finally and move on. She was there when Diana's portrait came home. She said the 5 words that followed Camilla down every corridor in that building. And now, she watched an institution that spent decades rewarding the wrong choices make a formal and documented decision to stop. She did not need a speech for any of it. She never has. And now let me tell you about William, because this is the part of the story that gets lost in the coverage, and I do not want it lost here. He got what he was building toward. He secured something for his mother's memory that cannot be undone through a quiet conversation or a diary adjustment or any of the mechanisms that were used to erase her in the first place. He put the institutional weight of the monarchy behind a formal acknowledgement that what was done to Diana in the years after her death was wrong, and he did it in a way that is now part of the documented record. That matters. It matters in the specific and permanent way that documents matter in an institution that runs on precedent. And it cost him something that I do not think gets said clearly enough. He did not enjoy that conversation with his father. The man sitting across from him at Clarence House with a folder on the table between them was not an obstacle. He was a father who is ill, who loves his wife, who has spent his reign trying to do something good with a life that was publicly savaged for a long stretch of it. And William sat across from that man and told him that the shield was gone and the reckoning was here. He did it because he believed it was necessary. He did it because he has always believed it was necessary, since he was 16 years old, in a room somewhere in a palace, working out the shape of what had happened to his mother. He has not changed his mind. He simply had to wait until he had the authority to act on it, without it costing him everything he needed in order to act. He has that authority now. He used it. And somewhere underneath the institutional precision and the documented precedent and the careful legal architecture of everything he built, there is a 15-year-old boy in a dark suit walking behind a coffin who grew up and changed the shape of the institution that failed the woman inside it. That is the honest read of this. All the rest is paperwork. And that is where this story has to end. Not with Camilla, and not with Charles, and not with the 3 sentences on palace notepaper that went out on a Tuesday morning and landed like a door closing. It has to end where every decision in this story ends. With Diana. She never saw any of it. She died in August 1997, and everything that has happened since, the portraits in storage, the flowers burned, the bedroom locked, the walls with a gap in them, the 25 years of patience, the folder on the table at Clarence House. All of it happened after she was gone. She did not get to see the wall corrected. She did not get to see the announcement or the 3 sentences, or the look on her husband's face the morning he sat across from his eldest son and understood that the reckoning had finally walked through the door. But she got something else. She got a son who paid attention, a 15-year-old boy who walked behind her coffin through the streets of London with his face completely still and his eyes taking in everything, who grew up and spent 25 years building the ground so carefully that nobody could ever pull it out from under him, who sat across from a king with a folder and did not blink. She would have known him. She would have recognized exactly what he had become. And I think that recognition, if she could have had it, would have been the thing that mattered most to her. Not the portrait, not the announcement, not any of it. Just knowing that the boy she raised had grown into a man who remembered. He remembered